Enot, Emet Malkeinu, Efes Zulato, Kakatuv Betorato, Ve'adatayom, Ve'hashevota, Elevavecha, Ki Adonai Hua Elohim, Bashamayim Ima'al, Ve'al ha'aretz, Mitachat Enot, V'ne'emar, V'haya Adonai, Lemelech al kol ha'aretz, Vayom hahu, Yeh Adonai echad, Ushemo echad. We now continue on the bottom of page 595. There are stars up above, so far away we only see their light, long, long after the star itself is gone. And so it is with the people we loved. Their memories keep shining ever brightly, though their time with us is done. But the stars that light up the darkest light, these are the lights that guide us. As we live our days, these are the ways we remember. Is there anyone now in mourning or saying yahrzeits?
This evening we especially remember Danielo Kutsenko, Helena Grunfeld, and Herb Irons. And the yahrzeits of Eli Adurin, Abraham Chapman, Holman John Charles Cockram, Andrew Dobos, Frank Firestone, Joseph Fradkin, Harry Goldstein, Lois Grigg, Danny Hamilton, Pamela Hyatt, Renee Ingersoll, Trudy Ingram, Marion Kaufman, Ernst Kaufman, Sidney Kaufman, Ernst Kahn, Zygmunt Kranz, Gertrude Langer, Helen Light, Kathy Lobbs, Alfred Lowy, Leslie Markman, Esther Maybruch, Alan Michael, Harold Isaac Michael, Rudy Moser, Theo Moss, Henry Nathan, Patricia Peck, Hanka Pilichovsky, Jaime Rockman, Frank Spernat, Evzen Strelecki, Alfred Sussman, Vivi Swinnerton, and Katarina Yarawi. In addition, we think of all those who died in the various attempted genocides throughout the years and the various catastrophes, all of which are commemorated on Tisha B'Av.
Just want to offer if anyone here would like to add a name to the list. Zichronam Levracha, may their memories be for a blessing. On page 598, the Kaddish tome, the Mourner's Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yikadash shemei Rabba, be'alma divrach yirateh v'yamlich malchuteh, b'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, ba'agala v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevorach le'olam olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitba'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei t'kudsha b'richu le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata da'miran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mrumav hu ya'aseh shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved. Amen. Please be seated.
And so in a few minutes' time, we'll be joined by those who are participating in the services in the two other rooms. And we'll have a moment to share some Kinot and Megillat Eicha. That is in the booklet that you received when you walked in, so you will need a copy. In the meantime, if you would like to light a candle, you are welcome to come forward and light a candle on either side in memory. We'll take a pause. The commentary inside the Megillah photocopy that you have is really a remarkable commentary by Adin Steinsaltz, which obviously, when we're chanting it, we will just chant it through it. So now's an opportunity for you to take a look at the commentary if you wish. For those who've just arrived, if you would like to light a candle in memory, you're welcome to do so. There are candles here up front. We're going to begin with Megillat Eicha, followed by the Kinot. For those who are chanting, you will need to use a microphone because that allows those online to participate. So just if you're within this vicinity, I can get a microphone to you. And Rabbi Kanya will introduce Megillat Eicha.
Do I stand here?
Wherever you are.
So, Megillat Eicha is one of my favorite books in the entire Tanakh. It's incredibly depressing and dark, and says a little bit about me. But what I love about it is that it's raw emotion. Like, it's literally raw emotion. Even in the title of the book, Eicha, it means how, right? It's like, if any of you have ever heard me talk about Eicha, I do this all the time. It's like, Eicha! And I'm actually not being dramatic. Like, I really believe that's how it's meant to be said. It's like utter shock, horror, anger. How could this possibly be happening? Now, for those of you that are joining us from Shira or Nitzan, I spoke about this briefly. You know, what's happening in Israel. I relate to how can this possibly happen? Like, shock, horror, you know, really it's a joke. But it's here. And so I feel like more than ever, I felt like COVID, I kind of understood Eicha more, but I think right now I feel like it hits really hard. and really real when we see our town's walls falling, the sacredness of what builds our home, our Jewish home, falling apart in our lifetime. We can relate. Echa was, according to our tradition, written by the prophet Jeremiah in the 6th century. And he kind of started by prophesying, saying, if you guys continue your bad ways, bad things are going to happen. And then the book of Echa really happens after the destruction. Biblical scholarship says it was written by 5 different authors, actually. And regardless of what we believe, who it was written by, the themes are very pure. It, again, raw emotion about loss and pain and about communal mourning. And each chapter has a different theme to it. I wrote them down so I didn't forget what they were. The first one deals with isolation and loneliness, right? After we feel a sense of loss, we feel lonely and alone and isolated and don't know where to go. The second chapter is filled with rage and anger. And if you notice the imagery, it's quite intense. Then you deal with guilt, right? It's chapter 3. The trope is different. It's longer, and it's in the eye. It's written differently, and it just says it's my fault. It's my fault. This all happened. The 4th chapter is just utter despair, right? Just utter despair. In the 4th chapter, we begin to see a sense of hope. We come out of it, and we go through that. And any of us who've lost our loved ones, we know what that feels like. It hurts. And we go through those stages. But this deals with a communal loss. How do you deal with loss? Each one of us feel it differently, but we feel it in community. And the last thing I'm going to say about, I guess, just the whole way of looking at it is there are 2 different theories, or 2 of the different theories of how we look at Echa. One is the prophetic model that says, we always ask, why does this happen, right? So the prophet said, well, we sinned, we did the wrong thing, we were punished, we ask for forgiveness, we repent, and then God forgives us, right? That's the prophetic model. We all are quite familiar with this. There's another model that's called the personal religion model, just looking at why does this happen. And you can see it. If you look at the words, you can see it. It says that God got angry. Not quite sure why. I do have lots to say about God's anger management issues. A lot we can learn from that, of what to do and not to do. But God got angry, and we actually don't know why. Maybe it was something we did. Maybe it was something someone else did. I don't know. God got angry. We dealt with the brunt of it. We lamented. We said, oh, that really hurt. That didn't feel nice. And then there was reconciliation. Sorry, maybe not all you. Maybe there's something we can do to work forward and reconcile and be together and be a people together again. Don't know. These models can work in our personal lives. It can work historically, and it can work with our relationship with Israel, with Judaism, with God, with family, with friends, with self. But whatever it is, I encourage us to either close your eyes, listen to the sound of the trope, of the music, listen to the words, read it, feel it. It's not to intellectualize, it's to feel.
For those online, you can find it at Sefaria, sefaria.com. We are using the commentary by Adin Steinsaltz, and we can see on screen only a section of it here, not the commentary, but it's also what you have in your hands. Caroline, if you'd begin.
Rabati am aita ke almana Rabati bagoyim Sarati bamedinot aita lamas Bachoti ke balayla Bedimata alechea Ein la menachem Mikal ahavea Kore היו ישבה בגויים, לא מצא מנוח כל רודפיה, השיגוה בין המצרים. דרכי ציון אבלות, מבלי באי מועד, כל שעריה שוממים, כהניה נאנחים, בתולותיה נוגות, והיא מעלה. היו צריה לראש, אויביה שלו, כי אדוני הוגה, הרוב פשעיה. עולליה הלכו שבי לפני צר, ויצא מבת ציון כל הדרה. היו צריה כאיילים, לא מצאו מרעה, וילכו בלא כוח לפני רודף. זכרה ירושלים ימי עוניה ומרודיה, כל מחמודיה אשר היו מימי קדם. בנפול עמה ויצא, ואין עוזר לה. ראו הצרים, צחקו על משפטיה.
חטא חטאה ירושלים, על כן לנידה הייתה. כל מכבדיה הסילוה, כי ראו ערוותה. גם היא נאנחה, ותשוב אחור. טומאתה בשוליך, לא זכרה אחריתה, ותרת פלאים. אין מנחם לה. ראה אדוני אדוני, כי הגדיל אויב. ידו פרס צר על כל מחמדיה. כי ראתה גויים באו מקדשה, על אשר ציווית, לא יבואו בקהל לה. כל מחמה, כל עמה נאנעים, במקשיב לכם. נתנו מחמדיהם, באוכל להשיב נפש. ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה.
לא עליכם כל עוברי דרך הביטו וראו אם יש מחוב כמחובי, אשר עולה לי, אשר הוגה אדוני ביום חרון אפו, ממרום שלח אש במות עצמותי וירדנה, פרס רשת לרגלי, השיבני אחור, נתנני שוממה, כל היום דבר נזכר, עול פשעי בידו יסתרגו, עלו על צווארי הכשיל כוחי, נתנני אדוני בידי לא חלקום. סלה כל אבירי אדוני בקרבי, קרא עלי מועד לשפוט בחורי, גד דרך אדוני לבתולת בת יהודה, על אלה אני בוכייה. איני יורד מים, כי רחק ממני, מנחם משיב נפשי. היו בני שוממים, כי גבר אויב.
פרסת ציון בידיה, אין מנחם לך סביבה, אדוני ליעקב סביביו צרב, הייתה ירושלים לנידה ביניהם, צדיק הוא אדוני כפי הוא מראיתי, שמעונה כל העמים, וראו מחובי, בתולותי ובחורי הלכו בשבי, קראתי למאהבי, הם הרימוני, כהני וזקני בעיר קבעו, כי ביקשו אוכל למות, וישיבו את נפשם. ראה אדוני כי צר לי, מאי חומר מרו, נפח ליבי בקרבי, כי מרו מריתי, מחוץ שכלה חרב, בבית כמוות. שמעו כי נאנחה אני, אין מנחם לי, כל אויבי שמעו רעתי, ששו כי אתה עשית, הבאת יום קראת, ויהיו כמוני, תבוא כל רעתם לפניך, ועולה למו כאשר עוללת לי על כל פשעי, כי רבות הנחותי וליבי דווי.
איכה יאיב באפו אדוני אספת ציון, השליך משמיים ארץ תפארת ישראל, לא זכר אדום רגליו ביום אפו. בילה אדוני ולא חמל, את כל נאות יעקב הרס בברתו, מבצרי בת יהודה הגיע לארץ, חילה ממלכה ושריה. גדה בחורייף, כל קרן ישראל השיב אחור, ימינו מפני אויב. ויבער ביעקב כאש להבה, אכלה סביב. דרך קשתו כאויב, ניצב ימינו כצר, ויהרוג כל מחמדי עין. באוהל בת ציון שפך כאש חמתו. היה אדוני כאויב בילה ישראל, בילה כל ארמנותיה, שיחת מבצריו. וירב בבת יהודה תניה ועניה. ויחמוס כגן סוכו, שיחת מועדו. שיקח אדוני בציון מועד ושבת, וינעץ בזם אפו מלך וכהן. זנח אדוני מזבחו, ניער מקדשו, הסגיר ביד אויב, חומות ארמנותיה. כל נתנו בבית אדוני כיום מועד. חשב אדוני להשחית חומת בת ציון, נטע קו, לא השיב ידו מבעליה. ויאבל חיל וחומה, יחדיו אומללו. טבעו בארץ שעריה, איבד ושיבר פריחיה. מלכה ושריה בגויים אין תורה, גם נביאיה לא מצאו חזון מאדוני.
ישבו לארץ, ידמו זקני בת ציון, העלו עפר על ראשם, חגרו שקים, הורידו לארץ ראשן, בתולות ירושלים. כלו בדמות עיניי, חממרו מעי, נשפך לארץ כבדי על שבר בת עמי. בתפלל ויונק ברחבות קריה. למותם יאמרו, איה דגן ויין. בהתהפם כחולל ברחבות עיר, בהשתפך נפשם על חיק אמותם. מה יבדך, מת מלך, הבת ירושלים, מה אשפלך וינחמך בתולת בת ציון, כי גדול קיים שברך מירפא לך. נביאייך חזו לך שבת תפל, ולא גילו על עוונך להשיב שבותך. ויחזו לך מסוד שווא ומדוכים. ספחו עלייך כפיים כל עוברי דרך, שרקו ויניעו ראשם על בת ירושלים. הזאת העיר שיאמרו כלילת יופי, משוש לכל הארץ. פצו עלייך פיהם כל אויבייך, שרקו ויחרקו שן, אמרו בילנו, אך זה היום שקיווינו מצאנו ראינו. עשה אדוני אשר זמם. ביצע אמרתו, אשר ציווה מימי קדם, הרס ולא חמל. וישמח עלייך אויב, הרים קרן צריך. צעק ליבם אל אדוני, חומת בת ציון, הורידי כנחל, דמעה יומם ולילה. אל תתני פוגעת לך, אל תדום בת עינך. קומי רוני בלילה, לראש השמורות, שפכי כמים ליבך, נוכח פני אדוני, שאי אליו כפייך, על נפש עולייך, העטופים ברעב בראש כל חוצות. ראה אדוני והביטה, למי עוללת כה, אם תאכלנה נשים פרים, עוללי טיפוחים, אם יהרג במקדש אדוני כהן ונביא. שכבו לארץ חוצות נער וזקן, בתולותי ובחורי נפלו בחרב. הרגת ביום אפיך, טבחת לא חמלת. תקרא כיום מועד מגורי מסביב, ולא היה ביום אף אדוני פליט ושריד. אשר טיפחתי ורביתי, אויבי קילם.
Chapter 3.
אני הגבר ראה עוני בשבט עברתו, אותי נהג ויולך חושך ולא אור, אך בי ישוב יהפוך ידו כל היום. פילה ושרי ועורי שיבר עצמותי, בנה עלי ויקף ראש ותלאה, במחשכים הושיבני כמתי עולם. גדר בעדי ולא אצא, הכביד נחושתי, גם כי אזעק ואשבע, סתם תפילתי. גדר דרכי בגזית, נתיבותי עיבה. דוב עורב הוא לי, ארי במסתרים. דרכי סורר ויפשחני, שמני שומם. דרך קשתו ויציבני, כמטרה לחץ. הביא בכליותי בני אשפתו. הייתי שחוק לכל עמי, נגינתם כל היום. השביעני במרורי, מרווני לענם. ויגרס בחצץ שיני, הכפישני באפר. ותזנח משלום נפשי, נשיתי טובה. ואומר עבד נצחי, ותאכלתי מאדוני. זכור עוני ומרודי, לענה וראש. זכור תזכור ותשוח עלי נפשי. זאת אשיב אל ליבי, על כן אוכיל. חסדי אדוני כי לא תמנו, כי לא חלו רחמיו. חדשים לבקרים, רבה אמונתך. חלקי אדוני אמרה נפשי, על כן אוכיל לו. טוב אדוני לקובב, לנפש תדרשנו. טוב ויחיל ודומם, לתשועת אדוני. טוב לגבר כי יישאו בנעוריו. ישב בדד וידום, כי נטל עליו. ייתן בעפר פיהו, אולי יש תקווה. ייתן למכהו לחי, ישבע בחרפה. כי לא יזנח לעולם אדוני. כי אם הוגיו ריחם כרוב חסדיו. כי לא עינה מליבו ויגע בני איש. לדכא תחת רגליו כל אסירי ארץ. להטות משפט גבר נגד פני עליון. לעבד אדם בריבו, אדוני לא ראה. מזה אמר ותהי, אדוני לא ציווה. מפי עליון לא תצא הרעות והטוב. מה יתאונן אדם חי גבר על חטאיו. נחפשה דרכנו ונחקורה ונשובה עד אדוני. נישא לבבנו אל כפיים, אל בשמיים. אנחנו פשענו ומרינו, אתה לא סלחת. סקות ואף ותרדפנו, הרגת לא חמלת. סקות וענן לך מעבור תפילה. שחי ומאוס תשימני בקרב העמים. פצו עלינו פיהם כל אויבינו. פחד ופחד היה לנו השת והשבר. פלגי מים תרד עיני על שבר בת עמי. עיני נגרה ולא תדמה מעין הפוגות. עד ישקיף וירא אדוני משמיים. עיני עוללה לנפשי מכל בנות עירי. צוד צדוני כציפור אויבי חינם. צמתו ובור חיי וידו אבן בי. צפו מים על ראשי אמרתי נגזרתי. קראתי שמך אדוני מבור תחתיות. קולי שמעת אל תעלם אוזנך לרווחתי לשבעתי. קרבת ביום אקראך אמרת אל תירא. רבת אדוני ריבי נפשי גאלת חיי. ראית אדוני עבדתי שופטה משפטי. ראית כל נקמתם כל מחשבותם לי. שמעת חרפתם אדוני כל מחשבותם עלי. שפתי קמי והגיונם עלי כל היום. שבתם וקימתם הביטה אני מנגינתם. תשיב להם גמול אדוני כמעשה ידיהם. תיתן להם מגינת לב תעלתך להם. תרדוף באף ותשמידם מתחת שמי אדוני.
We've reached chapter 4. As Rabbi Steinsaltz explains, due to its sins, Jerusalem was filled with victims, those dead of starvation and those killed by the sword. This lamentation describes the deterioration of the people of Jerusalem from their previous stature as a refined population to the lowest level it is possible to reach through siege and war. The residents of Jerusalem had placed their trust in foreign aid and had also hoped that their king would save them, but their hopes were dashed. The lamentation ends with words of comfort. Edom, which rejoices in the misfortune of Israel, will be destroyed too, and Jerusalem's disaster will end. Page 19, line 3 in the Hebrew, verse 1 of chapter 4. Echa yuam zav yishne haketem hatov tishtapecha avnei kodesh berosh kol chutzot b'nei Tzion hayekarim hamasulayim bapaz Echa nechshavu lenavlei cheres Masei yedeo etzer Gam tanim chaltzu ishad Heniku gurehen Batami la'achzar Ki cha'aynim bamidabar Devak lashon yonek El chiko evet sama Olalim sha'alu lachem Porei sein alahem Haochlim lema'adanim Nashamu bachutzot Ha'emonim adlei tola Chibeku asher patot Vayigdal avon bat ami mechatat Sodom Hahafucha chemoraga v'lo chalu eva yadayim Zaku nezira misheleg Zaku mechalav Admu etzem mipninim Sapir gizratam Chashak mishachor Toram Lo nikaru vachutzot Tzapad oram alatzmam Yavei shayechet Tovim hayu chalalei cherev Mechalalei rav Shehem yazvu medukarim Mitnuvot zadai Yedei Nashim Rachmaniot Bishelo Yaladehen Hayu Levarod Lamor Bishever Batami Kila Donai et Chamato Shafach Charona Po Vayetze Teish V'Tzion V'Toechal Yesodoteh
Lo heminu Malchei Aretz V'chol Yoshvei Tevel Ki Yavo Sarvoyev B'Sharei Yerushalayim Mechatot Nevi'eha Avonot Kohaneha Hashofchim B'kirba Dam Tzadikim Na'u Evrim B'chutzot Nigoalu Badam Belo Yuchlu Yegu Belvushehem Sirutame Karalamo Suru Al Tigau כי נצו גם נעו, אמרו בגויים לא יוסיפו לגור, פני אדוני חלקם לא יוסיף להביטם, פני כהנים לא נשאו, זקנים לא חננו. עודנו תכלנה עינינו אל עזרתנו הבל, בציפייתנו ציפינו אל גוי, לא יושיע צעדו צעדינו מלכת ברחובותינו, קרב קיצנו מלאו ימינו כי בא קיצנו, קלים היו רודפינו מנשרי שמיים, על ההרים דלקונו, במדבר ערבו לנו, רוח אפינו, משיח אדוני נלכד בשחיתותם. אשר אמרנו בצילו נחיה בגויים, שישי ושמחי בת אדום, יושבת בארץ עוז, גם עלייך תעבור כוס, תשכרי ותתארי, תם עוונך בת ציון, לא יוסיף להגלותך, פקד עוונך בת אדום, גילה על חטאותייך.
The final chapter. From Nitzan.
Okay, come up, Suki. Okay.
You do 1 to 11.
So we've come to the last chapter. As is written here, the Lamentation is different in that it is not an alphabetical acrostic, but it is similar to most others in that it has 22 verses, like the previous Lamentations. The suffering and troubles of the people of Jerusalem are described. Toward the end, the lamenter focuses his anguish on the destruction of Mount Zion, the source of his heartache. However, he emphasizes that although God's dwelling place in the world has been destroyed, God still remains. This provides hope for the restoration of the relationship and the brit, the covenant between God and God's people.
Before we begin, I apologize to take us out of Eicha for a moment. There is a Camry parked at the top of TBI Car Park with its lights on. It's YDK328, I believe. If you have a Camry, your lights are on.
Okay. We begin now with the very beginning of chapter 5, verse 1. Zachor Adonai meheyalanu, habita ure'et cherpateinu, nachalatenu nehefcha lezarim, bateinu lenocherim. Iotonim hayinu einav, imotenu ka'almanot, meimenu bechesef Shavtinu, Aetzenu, B'mechir Yavo, Al Tzavavrenu, Nir Dafnu, Yaganu, Lo Hunachalanu, Mitzrayim, Natanu Yad, Ashur Lisboa, Lachem, Avotenu, Chateu, Veinam, Va'anachnu, Onotehem savalnu, Avadim hashluvanu, porek ein miadam. B'nafshenu navi lachmenu, mipnei cherev hamidabar. Oreinu ketanur nichmaru, mipnei za'alufot hara.
נשים בציון עינו בתולות בערי יהודה, שרים בידם נתלו, פני זקנים לא נהדרו. בחורים תיכון נשאו ונערים בעץ כשלו, זקנים משער שבתו, בחורים מנגינתם. שבת משוש ליבנו, נחפך לאבל מחולנו. נפלה עטרת ראשנו, אוי נא לנו כי חטאנו. על זה היה דווה ליבנו, על אלה חשכו עינינו. על הר ציון ששמם, שועלים הילכו בו. אתה אדוני לעולם תשב, כסאך לדור ודור. למה לנצח תשכחנו, תעזבנו לאורך ימים. השיבנו אדוני אליך,
ונשובה עד ימינו כקדם.
השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם. כי אם מאוס מאסתנו, קצפת עלינו עד מאוד.
השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה עד ימינו כקדם.
השיבנו אדוני אליך, ונשובה חדש ימינו כקדם.
And Raf taking us into Kinot.
Can we make that bigger? Is that? There should be another one.
Right?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. And could we make it as big as possible? Yeah, great. Sorry, it's a narrow column. Okay, you may notice that this, sorry, I'm a new glasses wearer, so the dirge or elegy, the kina, this kina is basically a repetition of the final chapter of Eicha, and it's a responsive sort of rendition of it. And in Ashkenazi tradition, that begins the kinot for the night, but it's actually recited by Jewish communities all over the world. It's recited from Amsterdam to Yemen to Aden. It's through North Africa. It's a strange kinah because it's not an independent composition. It's a rendition of the fifth chapter, and it may hark back to a more ancient practice of responsive recitation of Eicha. Just a word on the kinah in general as a genre. It's one of the most ancient genres that we have. There are prophets that recite kinot that entitle chapters, biblical chapters, kinot, that entitle them dirges or elegies. So it's a song of mourning. And if we just ask for a moment why we sing songs of mourning, I think I used to struggle with this mourning for a Beis HaMikdash that I never knew, for a world I never knew, for a world that I'm not sure to what extent existed the way that we sometimes imagine it. And I think that it's the other way around. The point of the kinah is, and the point of this mourning and this grieving is to arouse grief. And the point is that it's actually not natural. for us to grieve, to recite dirges for a world we never knew. But it has an effect on us ideally, and hopefully can teach us to not be insensitive to a world that we can get used to its brokenness, and so with that, we'll recite. Shall I read it? Oh, so we'll recite each verse, and there is a response, oi, and oi me hayalanu, what has happened to us. Okay. זכור אדוני מהיה לנו אוי, הביטה וראה את חרפתנו, אוי, מהיה לנו. נחלתנו נהפכה לזרים, אוי, בתינו לנוכרים, אוי, מהיה לנו. יתומים היינו בן אב, אוי, אמותינו מקוננות בחודש אב, אוי, מהיה לנו. ממנו בכסף שתינו, אוי, כי ניסוך מים בזינו, אוי, מהיה לנו. על צווארנו נרדפנו, אוי, כי שנאת חינם רדפנו, אוי, מהיה לנו. מצרים נתנו יד, אוי, ואשור צדונו כציד, אוי, מהיה לנו. אבותינו חטאו ואינם, אוי, ואנחנו סובלים את עוונם, אוי, מהיה לנו. עבדים משלו בנו, אוי, כי שילוח עבדים ביטלנו, אוי, מהיה לנו. בנפשנו נביא לחמנו, אוי, כי קצפנו מעני ידינו, כי קצפנו מעני ידינו, אוי, מהיה לנו. אורנו כתנור נחמרו, אוי, כי כבודם בקלון המירו, אוי, מהיה לנו. נשים בציון עינו, אוי, כי איש את אשת רעהו טימאו וזנו, אוי, מהיה לנו. שרים בידם נתלו, אוי, כי גזלת העני חמסו וגזלו, אוי, מהיה לנו. בחורים תכון נשאו, אוי, כי בבית זונה נמצאו, אוי, מהיה לנו. זקנים משער שבתו, אוי, כי משפט יתום ואלמנה עיוותו, אוי, מהיה לנו. שבת משוש ליבנו, אוי, כי נבטלו עולי רגלינו, אוי, מהיה לנו. נפלה עטרת ראשנו, אוי, כי נשרף בית מקדשנו, אוי, מהיה לנו. על זה היה דווה ליבנו, אוי, כי נבטל כבוד בית מאבנו, אוי, מהיה לנו. על הר ציון ששמם, אוי, כי הר הבית משומם, אוי, מהיה לנו. אתה אדוני לעולם תשב כסאך לדור ודור. למה לנצח תשכחנו, תעזבנו לאורך ימים. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם. כי אם מאוס מעשתנו, קצפת עלינו עד מאוד. השיבנו אדוני אליך ונשובה, חדש ימינו כקדם. This second one is an unusual one to recite in the nighttime. Traditionally, it's the concluding kina of the daytime kinot, but because it's very well known and because many of us won't have an opportunity to recite it within a community and it has a well-known tune, I thought that would be an appropriate choice of kina. Just to translate the opening line, wail Zion and its cities, like a woman in labor pangs, like a maiden girt with sackcloth, mourning for the husband of her youth. So this again is intended to arouse grief. It's a day of grief. Eli Zion ve'areha כמו אישה בציריה וכיבתו לך חגורת שק על בעל נעוריה עלי ארמון אשר נוטש באשמת צאן עדריה ועל ביאת מחרפל בתוך מקדש חדריה אלי ציון עלי גלות משרתאל מנעים משיר זמריה ועל דמם אשר שופח כמו מימי יאוריה עלי הגיון מחוליה אשר דמם בהריה ועל הוועד אשר שמם וביטול סנהדריה עלי זבחי תמידיה ופדיוני בכוריה ועל חילול כלי היכל ומזבח קטוריה עלי טפי מלאכיה בני דוד גביריה ועל יופיים אשר חשך בעת שרוך קטריה עלי כבוד אשר גלה בעת חורבן דביריה ועל לוחץ אשר לחץ ושם שקים חגוריה עלי מחץ ורוב מכות אשר הוכו נזיריה ועל ניפוץ עלי סלע עולה לה ונהריה עלי שמחת אויביה שחקו על שבריה ועל עינוי בני חורין נדיביה טהוריה לפשע אשר עיוותה סלול דרך אשוריה ועל צבאות קהליה שזופיה שחוריה עלי קולות מחרפיה בעת רבו פגריה ועל רגשת מגדפיה בתוך משכן חצריה עלי שמך אשר חולל בפי קמא מציריה ועל תחן יצא וחולך כשוב ושמע אמריה אלי ציון ועריה כמו אישה וציריה וכיבתו לה חגורת שק על בעל נעוריה.
many of you might agree that this evening enjoys an unusually powerful resonance for those of us who love and care about and concern themselves with Israel, its citizens. If you look around this room, and I'm aware that there are those who with us tonight have never previously participated in a Tisha B'Av evening service, you'll see a number of symbols that are meant to connote the house of mourning. We are mourning, literally, the destruction of Har HaBayit and the Beit HaMikdash, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temples. But not only that, the loss of sovereignty, which required extraordinary resilience and courage and adaptation of our ancestors through nearly 2,000 years of forced exile. So I invite particularly my students and everyone to draw their attention to the parochet, the exquisite curtain that rests here always at Temple Beth Israel, and you'll see that it's torn back a little, as if to symbolize the kriyah, the tearing of the garments that the mourner performs, saying, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed be the righteous judge, when upon hearing news of one's death. And of course, the candle, which is used in the mourner's house and burns for a period of Shiva Yamim, of 7 days. The sitting on the floor in the wearing of non-leather shoes, as so many have already tonight, is another indication that one discomfits oneself when coming into the Beit Knesset at this time. That and a period of fasting which extends from the evening all the way to the end of tomorrow. So this fast is regarded as it would the Yom Kippur fast. So it's a very significant occasion. This evening's gathering will conclude with an address by Dr. Daniel Kupfert Heller, who is the Crown Senior Lecturer in Eastern European Jewish History at Monash University's Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. His areas of research specialization are Eastern European Jewish history, the history of humanitarian aid and international development, and the history of Zionism and modern Israel. Daniel is currently the lead investigator for an interdisciplinary study exploring the impact of gender on the resilience and adaptation strategies of Holocaust survivors in the aftermath of World War II. And unless, Daniel, your bio is well and truly out of date, are you still working on your second book project? We know how those things can go. They can take an awful long time. That book examines Holocaust survivor psychologists, psychiatrists, and other healthcare professionals who have made it their life mission to help fellow survivors heal from trauma and to move forward in their lives. And so as we observe a collective grief for those who have suffered and those who have died, Likudishat Hashem, and the loss of Jewish sovereignty, it seems so appropriate to have Daniel with us tonight. Please.
Thank you so much, Rabbi, for such a kind introduction. I was very grateful when you called our center, the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization, which Mark led for so many years, and you offered us the opportunity to speak on Tisha B'Av and pay tribute to him. Mark and I were not close, yet I owe so many of my life's blessings to him. It was Mark who encouraged me to move to Australia and apply for an academic position at the ACJC at Monash. It was actually Mark's fundraising that made this very academic position possible in the first place. He founded Shira Chadasha, giving my family a spiritual home, a place where we could be accepted and not simply tolerated as an LGBT family committed to Jewish life. I feel overwhelmed with privilege to live in and be a part of this extraordinary community which Mark built and loved so deeply. Our rabbinic tradition teaches us that on Tisha B'Av, throughout Jewish history, tragedy after tragedy befell our people. And the rabbis demanded that on this day we feel the cruel weight of these catastrophes all at once. How utterly horrific that for Mark's family, having to reckon with multiple tragedies in such a short time frame is lived experience and not religious ritual. We've just read Eicha, mourning the destruction of Yerushalayim and the first temple in 586 BCE. This ancient text is poetry suffused with grief, despair, and holy rage. When I reread Mark's writing in his books, The 50th Gate and 30 Days, in preparation for tonight, I could hear that very same poetry of grief, despair, and holy rage. In The 50th Gate, Mark wrote that the stones of Jerusalem look like the inside of a broken heart. If there was any day on the Jewish calendar to turn to Mark's writing to hear his voice once more, I think this would be it. Whether writing about the impact of the Holocaust or the destruction wrought by cancer on his family, two central questions haunted Mark. How do you mourn? How do you mourn all those people? And how do you live after such atrocity? These are questions that were taken up by Holocaust survivors, psychiatrists, and psychologists who are the subject of a book I'm currently writing. These survivors tried to use the tools of their trade to help fellow survivors and help themselves in their journey of grief and their search for hope. Tonight, I'd like to connect some of their insights about grief and hope with those that Mark shared with his readers. One of the things that I think Mark shared with many of the survivors that I'm studying was an understanding of the dangers that accompanied grieving in silence and grieving alone. Some of the psychologists and psychiatrists that I'm writing about had established medical careers prior to the Holocaust, and when the war ended, they wasted no time. As tens of thousands of Jews poured into Europe's displaced persons camps, psychologists like Henri Stern pled to US and British Army officials and to Jewish relief workers from organizations like The Joint to provide psychological counseling to survivors. But their pleas for assistance mostly fell on deaf ears. Amazingly, the prevailing view at the time, the prevailing medical view, was that unless you experienced psychological trauma as a very young child or sustained physical damage to your brain, it was virtually impossible to experience long-term psychological effects from wartime experience. I know. Much of the battle that survivor psychiatrists and psychologists would wage was quite simply to make the grief of survivors visible to others, to urge the medical community to listen to and to validate this grief. The French Jewish psychiatrist and survivor Eugène Minkowski was one of the first to alert the medical community to a cluster of symptoms that many survivors experienced that would decades later become the basis for PTSD as a diagnosis. He was joined in the 1950s and 1960s by Polish Jewish survivors Henry Krystal and Emanuel Tanai. These were psychiatrists who fought on behalf of thousands of survivors to receive disability support and financial support for therapy from the West German government. Survivors had so many good reasons to keep the depth of their grief a private affair. Any record of them seeking mental health assistance in a DP camp could be used against them by French, British, Canadian, US, and Australian immigration officials who were only too eager to find reasons to deny entry to survivors. Some survivors feared any disclosure of psychological torment would lead them to being incarcerated in an asylum. And indeed, in my research, I've found in the displaced persons camp that sometimes that's exactly what happened. In the 1950s and early 1960s, as they rebuilt their lives and established families in new locations, many sought to protect their children and perhaps themselves as well from their past. When Mark explored the consequences of this silence in the 50th Gate, he offered no simple answers for how to live with grief. Even as he acknowledged the dangers of silence, he also portrayed the dangers of forcing his parents to retrieve their traumatic past. In portraying their distinct trajectories during and following the Holocaust, Mark urged his readers to understand that there was no one survivor experience of grief, and most importantly, no one-size-fits-all approach to moving forward in life. I think that Mark sought in his work to instill the deepest sense of humility in his readers, a deep sense of humility in the face of the unimaginable grief of others. He sought for his readers to acknowledge that there is no singular way to grieve or mourn, and that we should be wary of trying to solve or fix grief. It's only through our humility in facing the unimaginable and through our willingness to be truly present with and acknowledge the grief of others that we can offer meaningful compassion. In my quest to find historical documents to help me tell the story of Holocaust survivor psychiatrists and psychologists, I found dozens of transcripts of therapy sessions between these survivor therapists and their survivor patients. And these transcripts run from the mid-60s to the late 1970s. These psychiatrists and psychologists had many disagreements about pathways for treatment. But one thing that united them, and it really struck me, is that they never once suggested to their patients that there was some reason or meaning for the suffering that they endured. In these transcripts, the topic of God often comes up. The patient rages against God for abandoning them, but the therapist remains silent. They may commiserate, but never once did I see in these transcripts an attempt to reduce their patient's rage or change their attitudes towards God. Mark may have been an atheist, but he believed in the power and the holiness of rage. My colleague Nathan Wolski remembers that the very first Jewish text he studied with Mark was a compendium of rabbinic commentaries on Eicha. Troubled by the fact that Eicha offered no real advice to the people of Israel for how they could move forward from such tragedy, the rabbis sought to fill the void by offering comfort and explanations for the suffering of the Jewish people, as well as for advice for how they can move forward. I suspect that Mark would have, to put it politely, shuddered at their attempts to reassure their readers that the very same God who caused their suffering also imbued them with an inner strength and endurance. Mark was constantly weaving ancient Jewish texts into his work, and I imagine that had he had the chance, he would have offered a very different approach to encountering the painful theological questions that accompany not only our individual suffering, but our collective history of suffering as a people. In 30 days, Mark described the final months of his first wife Karen's life before she passed away from cancer. It is a memoir of grief and love, but also holy rage. In one passage of the book, he recalled a nurse who told Karen to pray so that her chemo might work. Mark writes, and I quote, and forgive me for what I'm about to say. Karen took a moment before answering. "I've been praying a lot," she said, "but sometimes I just say, fuck." Mark continues, "Yes, fuck. It was not spoken in anger. It was not directed at anyone. It was simply radical amazement at her condition. What the fuck? That indeed is a prayer. I stand on the side of the believers of ancient times who resisted simplistic theories that pass for high-minded sermons. A metastasized cancer will spread, just as a drunken driver crossing the border between Poland and Germany will crash a car and kill my grandmother, just as a murderer with evil intentions will kill an entire village. So, Mark writes, all that is left for us to do is to pray from the deepest seat of our souls and to cry out the holiest of words. Fuck. Even as Mark constantly drew attention in his books to the limitations of language and memory in capturing the grief and the love that we experience for those who we've lost, Mark also deeply believed in the holy power of words, not just to express rage, but to express love, to honor the lives of those he and his family lost. Mark wrote that he never believed in the afterlife, but instead believed in honoring the dead through the souls of the living. And Mark used his extraordinary literary skills to do just that. This power of storytelling was not lost on the Holocaust survivor psychiatrists and psychologists. In the late 1970s, Dory Laub and Robert Krell, who were child survivors of the Holocaust who later became psychiatrists, began a campaign to record interviews with Holocaust survivors about their experiences. It is in fact thanks to their early efforts that we now have tens of thousands of recordings of Holocaust testimony. Even think about that term that we now use that seems so commonplace, Holocaust testimony. We owe it to psychologists and psychiatrists, many of whom were survivors, for making this happen, for insisting that there was value in our community to hearing their stories. In addition to these efforts, Robert Krell also pioneered one of the first Holocaust survivor speaker programs where survivors would go to high schools to share their experiences with students. Both Robert Krell and Dory Laub emphasized that even if these efforts exacted emotional costs on survivors, they also had a potential therapeutic effect. Instead of viewing their wartime memories as fragments or intrusions, survivors could view their life experience as having meaning. In sharing their stories as victims of genocide, they could play a role in preventing or at least reducing such suffering in the world. In our tradition, when we comfort a mourner, or when we speak of someone that has passed, we often say, Zichrona livracha, Zichrono livracha. May their memory be a blessing. I think that Krell and other survivor psychiatrists took this one step further by turning that blessing into a command. When we say, may their memory be a blessing, we're almost left passive to it. Maybe it should happen, let it happen. What if we were to say, make their memory a blessing? Mark's writing, I think, was his effort to do just that. First, with the family he lost in the Holocaust, and then with Karen. He turned to writing once more to capture his own experience of mortality with pancreatic cancer and coming face to face with it. I'd like to share just one more commonality between Mark's writing and the work of survivor psychiatrists and psychologists. If you were to leaf through the hundreds of studies now written by psychiatrists and psychologists of Holocaust survivors, you would see that they are often obsessed with viewing survivors solely in terms of deficit and dysfunction. They argue that the key task of mental health professionals is to help survivors overcome their grief and live happy lives. But the people that I'm studying, survivors who were psychiatrists and psychologists, they vehemently rejected this approach. In the words of Robert Krell, you can't cure the Holocaust. They instead sought to help survivors in their quest to live with their grief, to experience joy alongside it. In the 50th Gate, Mark immortalized his parents dancing at the Buchenwald Ball, where in Mark's words, they danced in defiance of their traumatic memories. And then in 30 Days, he lovingly described how he and Karen sought to teach their children to dance through their pain. The longing and the quest to grieve and hope, to cry and dance at the same time. Maybe, ultimately, that is the only thing we can do when faced with the grief of the world. Freedom, Mark wrote, is not a happy ending. It is a flame that dances in remembrance inside the darkness. The microphone. Thank you for asking that question. Mark, the rabbi just asked, do I know Mark's Hebrew name? I actually want to say a word about that. Forgive me. Well, it's Matityahu, but Mark also had a chosen middle name that he gave himself, Raphael. Raph, what does Raphael mean? God's healer. So yeah, Mark was an atheist, but I think that in his courage, his profound courage to write of his grief, he offered healing. And I can only imagine the thousands of people that have read his work who, in reading Mark's pain and reading his own quest to live with it, were touched and moved and felt a sense of community.
Thank you. Mark Baker passed away in May of this year. Having been born only in 1959, he was a credit to this community, a fine thinker and prolific writer who will be badly missed. I'd like to invite everyone to please rise as we'll chant an El Malei Rachamim in tribute to Mark's memory. Raphael Ben, do you know his father's name?
Matityahu ben Yosef וטוב אל מלא רחמים שוכן במרומים אמצעי מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה עם קדושים וטורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמת מתתיהו בן יוסף וטוב גיטל שהלך לעולמו בעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו אדוני הוא נחלתו ואנוח בשלום על משכבו ונאמר Amen. There's a tradition at Slichot to conclude the service in silence and to leave in silence, just as we come into a house of mourning in silence and leave in silence. So I understand that some of Shirah wanted to conclude part of Mariv in the Shlom Hall. As you conclude after Mariv, or if you are leaving now, try to leave in silence. Don't give greetings. Don't say anything further. I wish you all long life.